Thank you, and thank you all for attending. It's really great to see some friendly faces here. It's becoming increasingly likely that I will have to give this address remotely via video conference, so it's nice to be able to give it to a room full of people as well. So thank you for attending, and thank you for that introduction. Okay. So as Richard indicated, this address acknowledges and memorialises the work of Hilary Jolly. And Hilary Jolly was a freshwater biologist who was considerably ahead of her time. And I like to think there's at least some nice parallels with myself. She was born in New Zealand, born in 1906 in New Zealand, and was one of the first PhD graduates in aquatic science at University of Otago. And so she finished her PhD in 1959. And that work that she's done, still when you read her thesis, is one of those things you're like, wow, that's really cool. You know, it's just really neat research, well ahead of her time. She then moved over here to Australia and had a number of roles in Australian management agencies and policy agencies, and was a genuine leader in terms of supervising particularly female freshwater scientists at a time when freshwater science was 99% guys wearing plaid with big beards who study fish. With all due respect to the guys in the room wearing plaid with big beards who study fish, there's several of them. She then went on to become the president of the Australian Society of Limnology, which was later renamed by myself to the Australian Freshwater Sciences Society, and she was an incredibly important leader. Hilary passed away on the 30th of October 1975, and I was born on the 30th of October 1974. So when I was exactly a year old, Hilary left us, but she left us with a legacy of generations of students in particular who are limnologists. And so, yeah, an amazingly inspirational lady, and it's a great honour to be receiving the medal named after her. Before I go any further, I'd like to make two acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge and respect Te Runanga of Ngāi Tahu, on whose lands I was born and raised in the South Island of New Zealand, and where the Intercol Congress will take place later this year. So my mihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā tata katoa, ko Ross Thompson, tōko anoa, ko Opuke, te maunga, ko Hakateri te awa, ko Sir George Sima te waka, ko Peter Rā ko, kae te timaru oku matua, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which says welcome. It says that what my marae is, which is Hakateri, which is just south of Christchurch on the plains of New Zealand. And where my family's waka, which is most of my immigrants arrived on one of the early ships to arrive from Europe, the Sir George Seymour. So that's a recognition of Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu. But I would also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which University of Canberra is built, and express my respect for the elders past, present, and emerging. And I further acknowledge and thank the Arente people of Central Australia, who have been very generous about sharing their knowledge with me, and the Kamilaroi people of Northern New South Wales, who similarly have welcomed me to country and let me work on their country. And with the permission of Uncle Phil Duncan, who is a close friend and colleague of mine, he's given me permission to make a statement in Kamilaroi language with apologies to Brad Mogridge, who's here, for my likely horrendous horrendous accent. A terrible combination of Australian, New Zealand, French Canadian, a little bit of Maori. Some terrible things will be done to Kamilaroi, for which I apologise. But yaama, Ningen Dayu, Ross Thompson, Dahawan, Nahale, Dargan, Phil Duncan, Nawara, Darwan, Nahale, Bradley Mogridge, Darwin, Nahale, Ngunnawal, Nagaya, Winangailanya, Wayama, Wiangai, Nigiani, Ganu, which means I acknowledge on Uncle Phil Duncan, whose tribal name is Nawara, Bradley Mogridge, my friend and colleague here, the Ngunnawal people, and elders, all of them. Basically means all of the elders and respected people from any nation. So, it's very rare to get an opportunity to give a seminar. It's all about me. Really is. It's very exciting. It's kind of terrifying. And having looked at a whole lot of seminars like this, sort of medal seminars and things, I've decided that there's sort of two axes. There's the axes of awkward oversharing, where you tell a whole lot of people a whole lot of intimate details about your life, and the axes of delusions of importance, where you think that your work has had much greater importance than it really has. And so an Oscar speech, I think, is somewhere up there. You overshare and you think you're really, really important. A normal seminar belongs down here somewhere, not too much sharing, and hopefully not too deluded. And I'm going to go and try and aim for somewhere about here. So I will definitely be delusional about my importance at some point, for which I only vaguely apologise. So I was really fortunate to be brought up in, I think, a place that I miss the more for not being able to visit it at the moment. So I was brought up in the Southern Plains of New Zealand, characterised by these really stark, tectonically uplifted alpine zone, actively eroding into these amazing braided rivers that in their sort of uncontrolled, unflood-banked form would have flooded dramatically across the landscape and moved kilometres laterally. Recently there's a big flooding event in New Zealand, and they proved that even with floodplains, these systems can also move laterally kilometres. So there's massive flooding recently, which is about activating braided floodplains. I also spent a bunch of my time north of there, up in Kaikoura, which is in the eastern coast of New Zealand, north of Christchurch. Big volcanic, eroded volcanic caldera, amazing big steep mountains coming right down to the sea. And that was some pretty places to spend time. At the same time, in my sort of cultural upbringing, and some of these might look vaguely familiar, at least to Di Gleason, I was really fortunate to be brought up in a time when natural history storytelling was very much coming to the fore. The technology had allowed us to tell some amazing stories. And so the voice of David Attenborough was something that really represented a lot of the things that I experienced in my childhood life on Earth. I had the whole series of books by Jacques Cousteau, who, again, incredibly important pioneer of scuba technology, and one of the reasons that I got into scuba diving later. And through state-run television, which didn't have to worry too much about the advertising dollar, some really amazing narratives about New Zealand's natural history. Through a show called Our World, which we used to sit down with on a Sunday night and watch nature documentaries, and series like Wild South. New Zealand has an incredible natural history filmmaking reputation that has won multiple awards, and they continue to tell amazing stories. In terms of some of the environmental and ecological things that structured my thinking, I can remember being struck by the Ethiopian famine and drought, and by the awareness of what happens when an ecosystem utterly breaks down, the ability to support human values, but also wildlife values. The ozone layer and the hole in the ozone layer, which was a huge issue in New Zealand, where all of a sudden they were saying, don't put your kids outside, there's no ozone over the country at the moment, and they'll get lightning well done. So that was, look, human activities can influence a global system here. So this is essentially northern hemisphere pollution, which has generated a hole in the ozone layer in the southern hemisphere. So huge global consequences of human activities. On the counter side to that, a recognition of that ozone hole, which led to an international agreement, which banned a whole lot of the chemicals that were responsible for the ozone hole, and so showed that when globally we agree on a problem, we can actually enact a solution. That's a really positive thing. At the same time, locally in New Zealand, I was brought up in an area that was really characterised by relatively light intensity sheep farming. At the time that I was brought up, there was massive intensification of farming. And so the water bodies that had traditionally run clear and that you could have swum in when I was 10 years old are now not safe for contact recreation because of intensification of land use. And some really good news stories. So again, I think Di will remember things like kakapo, when we hit down to about 20 individuals of one of the most magnificent animals on this planet. Described by Douglas Adams as the world's largest, fattest, and least able to fly parrot. It's a nocturnal parrot that smells like warm bread. What's not like? What's allowed? Almost extinct in New Zealand, but pulled back to the brink. And now we are seeing around 130 in the world. And the black robin, the Chatham Island black robin, which got down to one aged female black robin. And again, they pulled that species back from the brink. To the point that when the female robin died, there was an offer of a state funeral for a bird. And so I thought it was rather wonderful that actually when we do apply our minds and energies to solving ecological problems, we can do so. I then moved to Otago University, which looks magnificent in those pictures. That's one of the 3 or 4 days a year when it isn't pissing rain. Dunedin is a very wet place, but a really rather lovely place to be a student, and surrounded by some amazing ecosystems. And so in terms of diving, and I could be half an hour from my house and diving in these beautiful kelp forests, magnificent systems. Lovely beaches, the world's rarest sea lion, which sometimes can be seen eating the world's rarest penguin. By definition, the world's rarest food chain, I presume. And these beautiful landscapes through into Fiordland. So we could go away for weekends and go hiking, diving in places like Milford Sound. These are really astounding places. So really lucky way to be trained. And at the same time, working with people like Colin Townsend, who's been obliterated by a video screen up the corner there, who I worked with from an undergraduate student, one of the best ecologists in the world, working on one of these magnificent systems, the Taieri scroll pane. But also, I got a chance to work on kakapo, beautiful bird I've already introduced, a chance to work on tuatara, magnificent animals left over from the age of the dinosaurs, and some of the world's largest and most charismatic invertebrates. That's this one. This guy's known to be spineless occasionally, but not all being an invertebrate. And the cool thing about that was that you really got a sense of how endangered these organisms are as a consequence of ecosystem management and ecosystem breakdown. And the challenge really of trying to rebuild the ecosystems that can support these charismatic species. Because these species aren't extinct because someone's gone out and harvested them. They aren't extinct because we've shot them. They're extinct because the ecosystem they rely on has broken down. And so I became really interested in this question of how do we rebuild, restore ecosystems? And so I'm going to go all science here now. So if we have a time axis, this is the sort of way I imagine ecosystems working. There are chunks of space that are defined by biophysical conditions that basically means a set of species or an ecosystem can't persist there. So there's biophysical limits on what an ecosystem can be. There is sort of the danger zone where things about that ecosystem have been degraded sufficiently that that ecosystem itself or its component species are in danger of being lost. So that's the bit you get worried when things start hitting. And then within that, there's the adaptive space. So conditions are changing all the time and the ecosystem's able to cope with that. Maybe this year's a dry year and next year's a wet year, but on the whole, over time, the ecosystem can, through internal processes, cope with that degree of change without dramatic loss of either ecosystem services or species. And so if we have a food web occupying this sort of space, year to year, place to place, that food web might change a little bit, it might bounce around. When it does get near to the thresholds of concern, there are processes that operate internally to that ecosystem that essentially deflect that community back into space where it's able to cope with change. What happens though when we start to really, really change systems? We can push those ecosystems literally to the edge, where the conditions that are affecting the biota are such that they are in danger of being lost. Ultimately, we may get to the situation where we cause large-scale extinction and those ecosystems themselves are severely damaged. What can we do about that? Well, those degradation processes can either be addressed through restoration or management that might allow us to try and push that ecosystem back into a state that allows the community we're interested in to persist. So what am I interested in? I'm interested in the rules that structure those food webs in the first place. What is it that creates those diverse systems that have their own emergent behaviors, their own internal feedbacks that allow diverse systems to persist through time? So what are the rules? What are the blueprints for making stable, persistent food webs? Hiding up in the corner here, and I'm just going to move myself just for a moment because there's going to be a bunch of text there. What are the features of those food webs that allow them to be robust to change? How is it that they respond to change such that species aren't going extinct all the time? How are humans influencing those ecosystems and causing ecosystem breakdown and species loss? And finally, what can we do to manage and restore those food web processes in order to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem function through time? So those are the sort of things that are really interesting. And so my research over the years has really sort of moved around that space. So my PhD was on the effects of forestry on stream food webs. So I worked with forestry companies to try and develop management protocols to reduce their impacts on in-stream food webs. So that was sort of sitting in the junction of all of those things. I've been a series of projects that I've been lucky enough to be involved in where we are describing what the rules might be for allowing complex systems to appear and persist in the landscape. So working in arid Australian waterholes, working in alpine New Zealand streams, looking at the resilience of ecosystems after really major perturbations like drought. Looking at the effects of stresses, anthropogenic stresses on ecosystems, and thinking about the way in which ecosystems may respond to those. So the work that Ben and I are involved in with other colleagues, looking at thermoplasticity and effects of climate change. Effects of climate change interacting with other stresses, such as heavy metals, and trying to understand the way in which our food webs may respond to a warming world, but a world that's also characterized by more extreme thermal stress. And finally, thinking about how we might manage our ecosystems in order to reduce the effect of those stresses or allow those ecosystems to have some robustness. That means they might, that's really bothering, I'm just going to get out of the way, that might allow them to be managed in such a way that will protect diversity and ecosystem services. So environmental flows, managing the riparian zones around streams, those are the sort of things that I've been lucky enough to be involved in. You'll notice the use of the royal we here. And it's important to know that I have a particularly professorial style of engagement in projects, which is that I rely really heavily on other people to do almost all the work. So I've been very fortunate to work with some amazing collaborators, some of whom are in this room, who I'm lucky enough to coattail along on. Particularly influential in my career, I would say, is Jenny Davis, who introduced me to work in the arid zone, Ralph McNally, who tried to teach me how to be a landscape ecologist, while being very grumpy at least half the time. Ben Kefford, who continues to maintain my interest in ecotoxicology and the way that multiple stresses operate in ecosystems. And of course, Fiona Dyer, who does so much of the heavy lifting around our work around environmental flows and urban waterways. It's not actually even as good as I only rely on these people. There's then a whole nother suite of people, which is all of my postdocs over the years. And I've been really fortunate to work with extremely clever people as they move through that exciting part of their career where they are developing their own independent ideas. And I'm really incredibly proud of my postdocs who I've worked with over the years, many of whom have gone on to fantastic careers, and I live vicariously through their success. And then, of course, it's not even as though they do all the work, because actually there's a whole lot of others. This is my PhD students. And I ran out of room to put honours and master's students on here, but there's been an awful lot of people who have done the actual work and research. And one of the most exciting things about being an academic is the opportunity to share with people their career as it grows, to benefit from their brilliant new ideas. And the single best thing is watching people really come into their intellectual confidence and really share ideas, challenge what I think, tell me I'm wrong. There's always that great moment, the first time a PhD student tells you you're wrong. It's a really important stage in your development. So I've been fortunate to work with amazing people from all parts of the world and from working on a huge range of different projects. And again, they've all gone on to careers that I think and hope have made them really happy. So all of these people that I really relied on, and thank you to all of them. Okay, so here's our plot. Dangerously moving, I think that was close enough to walk it over sharing for now. I'm a New Zealander, that's pretty emotional for me. So let's move on back to some science. So what I want to do a little bit is just take you through those 4 questions that I think are interesting. I'm going to explore the first two questions in much more depth than the latter ones. That's just so when you look at your watch and go, oh my God, this is going to be a 2-hour-long seminar. It won't be. And I'm going to begin with, are there rules? And I always found this idea really evocative, that there might be a blueprint, a rule book that says, how do you build a community that allows species to persist through time? And I'm not the only person to have found that evocative. Really, particularly through the 60s and 70s, there was a whole lot of scientists who were trying to disentangle what the rules are for assembling a successful community, which is a community that maintains its processes and its diversity through time. This is Stuart Pym's book, which is still a great read. He later somewhat blotted his copybook by producing a book called The World According to Pym, which was a spectacular bit of hubris, but nonetheless was actually a really fascinating book. And I've been fortunate enough to work with Stuart a little bit over time, and he was really interested in this idea of what are the mathematical patterns we can see in food webs. Would that allow us to create a map to assemble new stable food webs when they've been degraded? So a pile of research into the rules that make up food webs. And again, I love this idea that there might be a blueprint for a successful stable food web. Now, of course, the problem with real food webs is that they're really, really complex. And so that's a picture of one of the food webs that I described for my PhD. And so the blueprint's going to be a complex one. Unfortunately, by the 70s, most people who were doing ecology had decided that the people who were doing this kind of rules-based ecology were idiots. And famously, Don Strong wrote an article which described food web theory and food web science as a ladder for pricking strawberries, a really, really complex way to not do something very well. There's been some response papers since about whether it is a ladder for picking strawberries, how do we shorten the ladder, how do we make the strawberries higher. There's all sorts of things that have gone on since. But the point was that this idea that there might be rules for how communities were assembled was really attacked quite aggressively. And rightly so, because a lot of the data we were working with at the time was really, really dodgy. And so the rules you extracted tend to say more about the people describing the system than about the system itself. Now, I'm going to use the word food web very loosely through this talk. And I want to convince you that what I do is really, really difficult and complex. And this is what this slide's about. So just a note that when I'm talking about food webs, what I'm doing when I describe food webs is going out into the field or getting other people to do it for me, taking samples, identifying the animals that are in those samples, which can be its own amount of work. Looking at the gut contents mostly. Most of my work is gut content based. Looking at gut contents ages you. I had more here. It was all a dark color when I started doing this stuff. You then generate a matrix, a weighted matrix, the stuff that I do. It's not just feeding links happen or they don't. It's weighted by how strong those feeding links are. And you can do some really cool stuff using network graphs and graph theory around analyzing those big complex networks. And you can do cool stuff from that. You can generate flux diagrams of where energy is going through communities. You can calculate attributes that describe those communities. But what I'm going to do today is, is basically just express them as simple diagrams. So you're going to see a whole lot of simple food web diagrams. And I want to reassure you that my food webs indeed don't have 8 species in them. They have between 100 and 500 species, and they're very complex networks, and it's really difficult to do. So there. All right. So I was lucky enough to be involved in an effort that was actually by my supervisor at the time, who said, I think this food web stuff's all nonsense. I'm going to try and do one last big study that proves it. So we had a proper null hypothesis. He said, I think most of the food web rules that people have talked about are nonsense, and I'm going to describe a really, really great data set to prove it. So it was actually quite a good project to be involved with, because we found a lot more interesting rules and patterns than we thought we were going to, because what we expected was to find nothing. So I was working in the southern part of New Zealand at the time. So down here in the Tairi, the river of shining waters, just inland of Dunedin, and fortunate enough to be able to describe food webs from a whole lot of different land uses. So Pinus radiata, which is about 10% of New Zealand's land area, essentially for pulpwood, tall native alpine grasslands, New Zealand podocarp forest, and heavily farmed agricultural lands. So I'm not going to go into great length about what we did, but essentially we were working on 50 to 100 streams across those different land uses. And we just had this idea, we're just going to describe everything we could think of. Classic community ecology hypothesis, no, let's just measure a whole lot of stuff. So we described ecosystem characteristics, everything from substrate to flow, to discharge through time, to every possible thing you could think of. Because it was the 90s, we used radioactive isotopes in chambers to measure algal productivity. Wouldn't do that these days. And describe the food webs in the way that I just discussed. So let's jump to the end. What did we find out about that? Well, one of the surprising things was the important role of productivity in these ecosystems. Now, for those of you that are worried about statistical outliers, like this one, I can reassure you if you take that statistical outlier out there, there is still a slow positive slope here. And what this showed us was that actually longer food chains existed in more productive streams. Now that's actually quite important because the top of the food chain, the big consumers at the top, are often our species of conservation concern. Think grizzly bears in North America. Think large predatory fish in Australia. And it turns out that you can genuinely lose those species in situations where basal energy declines. And in fact, you can describe that in lots of different ways. In this case, I'm showing on your left up there what the food web looked like in grassland systems where there's lots of energy coming in, lots of sunlight, lots of nice grasses that are delicious and edible, and lots of energy flowing through the top species. But also a really diverse system. So longer food chains, we've got lots of intermediate species. Forested systems, much less energy coming in at the bottom, many fewer intermediate species. Energy is going through perhaps a food chain that might only be 2 or 3 links long. I was fortunate enough during my PhD to get a research fellowship to go and work in the US and to try and test some of those ideas. And one of the reasons that I was really interested in testing this was that we had Pinus radiata in New Zealand, a North American tree species for which there was nothing equivalent in the native fauna. And we'd basically taken that Pinus radiata landscape, picked it up from North America, moved it halfway down around the world and slapped it down in New Zealand. So you created this huge ecosystem scale experiment. So I was working in Maine and North Carolina. The banjos were strumming, just saying. And so working on Pinus radiata systems from New Zealand, Pinus strobus systems in New Zealand, in North America. Pinus radiata is in North America, obviously. It's also wildly rare and mainly grows on the Monterey Peninsula, where it's extremely grudgingly dying out. When you go to New Zealand, that's freaking everywhere. So Pinus strobus was the best, and we could look at streams that were really very similar. The photos between a stream and a pine forest in New Zealand and a stream and a pine forest in the US, you wouldn't be able to tell the photos apart. And so I described food webs in all of these places, and again, to cut to the end, if you looked at food webs from New Zealand grassland streams, so these were most of the areas where the Pinus was being planted. You know, this is the food web structure described in an ordination. All you need to take away from this is that symbols that are close together on this ordination represent food webs that are similar to one another. So in our grassland streams, 2 grassland streams shown there, 2 different food webs, but pretty similar to each other, highly diverse, long food chains, lots of productivity. New Zealand native forest streams, quite different food webs from what you get in the grassland systems, much flatter, different species in them, rather more connected, lots of different characteristics about them. New Zealand pine forest streams start to look pretty similar to native forest, a little bit different, but pretty similar. But the really fascinating thing to me was that if you looked at food webs in North Carolina streams and food webs in Maine streams in pine forest, they were more similar to the pine forest streams in New Zealand than the pine forest streams in New Zealand were to the grassland streams and the native forest streams in New Zealand. So despite a completely different suite of taxa, no overlap of species whatsoever, the food web that gets assembled under those similar physical conditions is essentially indistinguishable from one another. So there's some rules hiding in there. And so that really provided some evidence, and there's a bunch of other studies I won't talk about today, for a set of rules that determine food web structure. And those rules appear to have really important implications in terms of the ability of ecosystems to support top predators. And as I've said, those top predators are often of real concern to us. Something that really came out of this, I think, was sort of new to me, but something that had actually first been talked about way back in the 40s, was that energy supply was one of the major drivers. So if you're doing anything in a management sense, which is messing with energy supply, you will be having profound effects on the ecosystem. All right, so consistent rules. I was then interested in what happens when we start messing with food webs. And again, part of my PhD was based down Taieri River in New Zealand. And these were ecosystems that were being, I don't know, what's the polite way of saying this? Screwed over big time, something like that. So clear-cut forestry, no riparian buffers. This is a geomorphologist for scale. So Kathy Peacock, a colleague of mine. So what you do is you cut down the pine trees, you then put a big steel hawser across the valley, you strap the pine trees to them and you drag the pine tree across to the other side. On your permit, it says that at all times that log will be suspended above the stream, but that's actually really dangerous. And so the minute there's no one watching, what you do is you drag the log along the ground, you sweep all of this debris into the stream channel, and then you drag it up the other side. So really dramatic perturbation. So lots of changes in energy supply, lots of changes in species, lots of loss of species. So I was really interested in this question of, well, is there anything about the food webs that occur pre-harvest that might make them a little bit tougher and able to cope with this massive disturbance? So describing food webs again, and you could turn those food webs into an ordination. I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining this, partly because it's a long time ago and I struggle to remember, but essentially you have pre-harvest food webs here with the little green triangles. They change over harvest to the black squares. So the food webs have changed a lot at this B site. They've changed a moderate amount in this AA site. They've changed not so much in this site. So this is a measure of how much the food web changed when it was massively disturbed. And so I was interested in what was it about the food web before harvest that might have made it tougher, stronger, less likely to change in response to that perturbation. So here I've got food web robustness, which is basically a measure of how tough a food web is. And then I've got different things on the x-axis. First one I show is the number of trophic links per species. And that's because there's been a lot of hypotheses that say that food webs that are highly connected and highly diverse might be tougher. There'll be lots of feedbacks going on so that if you do perturb the system, then they'll be able to cope with that, essentially. They'll be more robust. The only real problem with that bit of theory is that it's not supported at all by this data. And in fact, it's the opposite. Here, the most diverse, highly connected food webs changed the most when they were disturbed. And that now has become really widely described from empirical systems around the world. And so the idea that having lots of species in a system and having it highly connected is somehow going to protect us from the effects of disturbance. The only real problem with that hypothesis is that it appears to be wrong. The most thing that really predicted how tough a food web was whether it had been exposed to previous disturbance. So if you only had the tough species left at the start, they were capable of coping with disturbance. So systems that had been disturbed before and had lots of taxa that had what we call resilient traits, things that made them tough in the face of disturbance, those made up the most resilient food webs. Now, a bunch of years later, I was given the opportunity to test some of these ideas in Australia, working particularly up in the Pilbara, but also down in Central Australia as well, working on some really, really beautiful places, these arid water holes that are spread through the central part of Australia. And what we were doing was essentially looking at waterhole communities and understanding how degradation had affected them and which of the waterhole communities had proved to be able to cope with degradation and which had not. We did a lot of landscape ecology at the time. I like to think of this as the nefarious impact of Ralph McNally, my colleague, looking at how connected waterholes were to one another through the landscape and whether being closer to a waterhole that was in good condition might prevent another waterhole from being degraded as substantively when it's affected by disturbance. And sure enough, through a whole lot of really complex, cool tools that my colleague Paul Sunnix in particular was working with something called circuitscape, which measures how connected habitats are across the landscape. Sure enough, what that tells you is that if you can maintain the connections between habitats across the landscape, they're more capable of dealing with disturbance. And that's sort of intuitive, right? You lose a species from this patch of the habitat, but it's able to recolonize from this patch of the habitat. But maintaining connectivity is exactly the opposite of what we do most often when we're doing conservation. We create a reserve, we say that's not going to be touched, and the rest of it, we'll smash it if we have to. So this connectivity between habitats is incredibly important. We again were able to test that further in some work we did in the Alpine zone of New Zealand that I won't talk about today. So there's evidence that particular features of food webs do make them more robust to the effects of disturbance. So taxa which have already experienced previous disturbance, landscape connectivity, but unfortunately not just being more diverse and interconnected. Having lots more species in a system doesn't seem to make it any tougher in response to disturbance. Okay. I was really lucky in 2012 to get a future fellowship, an ASC future fellowship. It had downsides. It meant that I entered into a period of my career where I spent 5 years without teaching, which I've realized now I'm back at teaching is actually something I really missed. But it also gave me a chance to reflect with colleagues on where we were at with all this food web stuff. And really what indicated the next part of my career is this statement from this paper, which is that I felt like the food web knowledge we'd had was placing us into a position where we could start to think about managing ecosystems using our food web understanding. And that really there were enough profound challenges affecting ecosystems around the world that we were obligated to try and apply this knowledge. So, serious delusions of grandeur moment. So, what were the effects, food web effects of anthropogenic stresses? This part of the talk, when I originally wrote it, was sort of indicative of why no one wants to sit beside ecologists at dinner parties. It was just like a list of ways we've screwed the world up. And it's kind of a little bit depressing. So I'm going to just do this with this section. So these are papers that I've been co-authored on, which have described the way in which anthropogenic stresses can impact on food webs. Profoundly, in complex ways, in ways that we can't always predict very well, via indirect effects, ranging from impacts that are surprisingly small given the size of the disturbance to impacts that are really profound given the tiny size of the disturbance. Unpredictable, difficult. There's an abundance of ways that humans can impact ecosystems, both negatively and positively. But there's also some real nodes of hope in there, that ecosystems can be really robust and resilient if we give them a chance, if we manage in a way that actually allows these systems the room to recover. So I want to move in the last sort of 10 minutes to talk about how we can manage and restore food web processes. And I'm promising this will be pretty brief. So really from the time that I was working in Canada a long time ago, I started to think about how do we communicate with policymakers and managers. I've been trying to get closer to the management and policy world to try and understand how our scientific knowledge can actually be applied to create change. The very worst of ecological knowledge can be described as like wetting yourself in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, no one else notices. Right? So the wetting yourself in a dark suit style of science, I got a little bit sick of. And I love the fact that people do fundamental science. I think it's great, but it's got to the point where I felt like the problems the world was experiencing required me to be much more applied in my focus. And so I made the very scary and difficult attempt to try and engage much more closely with policymakers and managers. And again, I can't thank Fiona enough for being somebody who eased that transition, because it's a very difficult transition. I'm also fortunate enough now to be involved in a large project, about a $7 million project, where we're looking at the way in which to manage environmental flows with government, partnering with them where we have at least weekly, sometimes more than weekly, conversations with our policymaker and manager colleagues, and they ask the question, so as a scientist, what do you reckon we should do here? And that is the level of conversation that I want to have. We used to like to imagine that we would do science and produce papers and then magic would happen and those papers would somehow be converted into policy and management outcomes. That is almost a complete myth. It does not happen. So there has to be another pathway, and the pathway actually is co-development of knowledge, where one output is science, is management and policy outcomes, and the other output is scientific papers, but there's no line between this one and this one. Okay, they're just different products of the same process. The Flowmere project is something I'm incredibly proud of, much as it is also responsible for a big head-shaped dent in my desk, because it periodically drives me crazy, because it's 24 organizations, it's 69 scientists, it's herding cats on the sort of biblical scale. It's also a great opportunity to do some really management relevant science. Check out our website, it's cool. Of course, all of this, once again, relies on a team of people, many of whom are in this room, who actually do the hard work out in the field. I'm vanishingly rare in the field. So that's one part, getting closer to science and management. The other part really comes to the work that we were doing in Arid Australia, and we originally had a discovery project in Arid Australia, and this is work that I did with Dee Davis and Paul Sunnix, which addressed a whole lot of cool things around using arid Australian ecosystems as an ecological model. The problem with going out to those ecosystems is you realise they are in heaps of trouble, particularly from invasive species, that they are the forgotten ecosystems of much of Australia. No one thinks about waterholes in Central Australia, but there's an awful lot of them out there and they're really badly damaged in many cases. And so I was given an opportunity to work with colleagues and I got introduced to the wonderful Jane Brimbox, who's a Northern Territory scientist who we still work with. Dennis McBurney, who became an honours student of mine working on the impacts of camels and waterholes in Central Australia. Veronica Dobson, Auntie Veronica Dobson, who's an Arrente elder who knows more about plants than any person I've ever walked through country with. And we got a chance to do this amazing work on sacred sites that have been heavily affected by human activities. And I think one of the most powerful quotes was from one of the elders who said, "Our waterholes are suffocating." And they're suffocating because basically camels, donkeys, cows, and horses have gone into these habitats and obliterated, done huge amounts of damage. So I became involved really in the Indigenous way of thinking about these systems and thinking about how do we engage with the first peoples of this country in order to try and manage landscapes better. I was then lucky enough to come across this guy, and it's one of the people who has really influenced my career, so thank you, Brad. Brad Mogridge, who of course is now a PhD student with me and is of course an associate professor in the centre. But Brad has a career which has really profoundly influenced the way that we think about Indigenous water in Australia. And this fellow down the bottom, Uncle Phil Duncan, who's a Kamilaroi elder. Uncle Phil and I met over a common love of red wine. But nonetheless, I think we've developed that into a friendship where we really do talk a lot about how can we do a better job of connecting with First Nations people to try and get land, sand, water management right. And this is obviously some of the work that we've been involved in publishing most recently. Again, I say we, Brad does the work, I occasionally head of stuff. So all of this has led to really where my career is sitting at the moment, which has been thinking much more not about the networks, the ecological networks, but also about how do we weave social, political, and economic networks together with ecological networks. And so I've been publishing a lot in this area, somewhat ironically, initially funded through a German government grant, which meant I got to go to Germany a couple of times and work with a whole lot of other Australians, which is a very strange thing. But particularly looking at social ecological systems. How do we bring people and ecological systems together? How do we operationalize what we know about network theory and food web networks in order to actually implement policy and management change? And I think the take home from that for me is really you cannot ignore the human dimension of these ecological problems. And we do so, I think, at our peril. Restoration and effective management is absolutely possible. But it's only possible if you go back to the very start of my talk and think about how do you communicate an excellent narrative. It always has to be based on the best science. The science has to be there. But if it's just science, it's the wetting yourself in a dark suit moment. It's great, but it doesn't make a difference. So how do you communicate a narrative? Well, there's lots of ways of doing that, and there's science communicators here in the room, and they do a really important role in terms of doing that. But it's also about having trusted networks where you can sit down with policy and management people, and they know you're not going to beat them up. You're just going to genuinely talk about how you have to address the shared challenge of making things better. And finally, none of this is relevant if community and society don't accept that you have a right to influence and manage these systems. This is what we talk about, social license to operate. In the Murray-Darling Basin, where we do a lot of our work, we got dangerously close to losing our social license to operate because most of the community didn't accept that there was an ecological problem that needed to be solved and managed in an intensive way. We didn't do a very good job of sharing the narrative of how we could do that change. We do much better now, but nonetheless, a lot of damage was done. So you have to maintain that social license to operate. Otherwise, you will just be doing research and making policy advice that is not relevant, because it can't be implemented. So I started by showing you my sort of conceptual vision of the world. And I want to now completely change it by saying that that ecological perception of the system is not enough. Ecology must work with social and political forces. We must consider these as whole systems and think about how they change through time and through that landscape, and how can we manage the economic, the political, and the ecological drivers. Because if we actually want to protect the places that we really care about, and this is the Tyree scroll claim, which is where I started doing my research work far longer ago than I choose to remember. If we want to protect these places, we're going to have to do more than just publish scientific papers. So I'm going to say bring on the storytellers, the social scientists, the managers, the policymakers, treat them as collaborators and equals in the process of evoking change. And through that, we can ensure that our science actually makes a difference soon enough to protect the places that we really care about. So I've now gone nuclear on my delusions of importance, way off the axis. So it's probably just about time to invite your questions.
Thanks very much, Ross. That was a wonderful overview, and I think gets a lot of insight into a career trajectory that I think's been stellar, as recognised by the Medal Award, but also, you know, quite a lesson really for how we can take the science that we do and start to really think about how to apply it in a meaningful way. So thanks very much, Ross. So great. So questions.
So you can either be loud or wait for the microphone. That's the two strategies for questions here. And any ecology student who's here who asks me a tough question, not liking the chances of an HD, just saying.
How do you start to build those connections with policymakers?
I think so. That's an excellent question. How do we build those connections with policymakers? I think introductions really help, and I've always benefited from exceptional introductions. There's a set of behaviours you can't do anymore. There's a role for academics to be outside of the system, sort of throwing grenades into it and trying to create change that way. But once you've done that, you will not be readmitted into processes, very, very rarely. So you have to commit to a particular pathway, which is having genuine conversations. You have to accept that you won't necessarily be on the front page of the newspaper, because sometimes that will damage trust with policymakers and managers. And I think you have to have genuine conversations that acknowledge you don't know everything. There's nothing that pisses a manager off more than you walk into the room and say, my science says this. You're much better to walk in and say, what are your management problems and how can we bring them to bear? We're fortunate that for whatever the failings of water policy in Australia, and there are many, it's very open to science. It was founded on science in the first place. And so there are a set of people who are open to a scientific conversation around policy. So we're lucky that way. But yeah, my only advice is, you know, go into it with your eyes open, make sure that you speak in a way that is a trusted advisor. Sometimes that means you speak behind closed doors. But if you do that, you have that incredible moment where you realize that some of your science has actually made a difference to the way that something's been done on the ground. And there's nothing more satisfying than saying that system is better. Won't be fixed, but no, these systems are fixed. But it's better because of my science. So yeah, it's a bit of a loose, floppy answer, but nonetheless, you'll hear lots more about it in one of the courses you're doing this semester. No questions? Come.
Following up to the previous question, what do you do when there's a policymaker who has not the best intentions for everyone? So, water corruption in Murray as an example of that.
So I very rarely, if ever, met a policymaker who doesn't have the best intentions. Politicians all the time. But the policymakers in general, how can we, they'll have a reason they're doing things. Maybe the reason's economic, maybe the reason's social, maybe the reason's ecological, but they'll have a reason they're doing it. So no one's doing things because they're a bad person. So you sit down and try and understand their narrative. Why do you think that's the right policy? Why is that the right intervention for this system? And you can then have a proper conversation about it. The idea that there's bad policy, there's policy which is poorly written, but mostly policy is actually trying to create a positive change in some part of the community or some part of the ecosystem. Once you accept that, and that there's not bad guys out there, you can have a genuine conversation. Sometimes you will fundamentally disagree with policy. And if I was to feel like this policy is so not open to genuine science that I don't feel like my participation in the consultation around this policy is helping, that to me would be the moment that I walked away and said, right, then maybe it's best I'm outside the system throwing grenades to try and make change happen. But I've never actually felt that way. I've always felt like it waxes and wanes a bit, but in general, our science is contributing to things moving in the right direction. I think Mark's probably had a different experience with the Snowy 2 scheme, where sometimes you're involved in those management roles or those policy roles and you just go, I'm washing my hands of this, this is a terrible idea. There's no doubt of time for that, but I haven't experienced it in my career to date, fortunately. Mark.
As someone who's been a grenade thrower and someone who's worked in the system for a long time, my perception is that the pace of change is incredibly slow, and it seems to be sort of decadal. You know, you can spend 10 years screaming at something and finally you get small shifts. How do we in the environmental sphere who are trying to influence government, how do we deal with that long time frame stuff? How do we mentor other people to take over when you shut off the water? It's a bit outside this scope.
No, I think it's actually a really good question. And there's a couple of things. When you're in the system, you have to be patient and you have to accept it's really slow. Then there's the question of what happens if it's too slow? And I think a lot of people in this room would look at climate change policy in Australia and say, too slow, you're not doing this fast enough. The problem is going to be bigger than you can manage before your policy catches up. And again, it's not that the policy's bad, it's just the policy setting is too slow to be able to cope with the problem that's in front of it. And I think there's a really important role for a diversity of scientists in those things. I think you do need people who are outside the system screaming. Because sometimes even within the public service, you'll say, we really want someone to be really critical of the media because that's going to help us go to the minister and say, we need to do this faster. So I just think it's being open to that diversity of scientific roles. If you're in the system, you have to be patient. If you're outside the system, you need to be effective in how you're throwing the grenades and not just be destructive. But I just think it's something that worries me as well in terms of, gee, is any of this happening fast enough for us not only to arrest the decline, but to start to reverse it? And yeah, that will make you wake up at 3 AM screaming sometimes. Successionally, I'm just relying on training a lot of brilliant undergraduates and postgraduates who can fix all the world's problems, personally.
I also wanted to ask, so with that stuff in the like Central Australia, and again, bouncing off the message that just happened there, when these processes are really slow, how do you build momentum with them? How do you make them seen when they, like, you know, in Central Australia, it's not really somewhere that's got a lot of focus on it in media or in a lot of learning, like other than the LaRue. Like, how do you bring attention to those areas that do really need some attention and do that in a time frame so that you can actually make a positive change or make something happen?
use all of the arrows that are in your quiver. So use narratives, use social media, tell the stories really, really well. And then if you don't get traction, don't give up. Because my experience of a lot of the science we do is that you'll push and push and push and nothing will visibly change. And then all of a sudden something will shift within policy and there'll be traction and you'll get something. And so there's the thing about telling your stories really, really well, because that does influence the grassroots. You know, if you're seeing a story that's saying, gee, camels are having a terrible effect in Central Australia, we need to do something about it. Nothing happened for decades. And then all of a sudden there was a massive investment of funds to try and manage camels. And I don't think anyone could have predicted that coming. It just came out of nowhere from political change. So I think you have to be patient enough to keep pushing. And not get exhausted doing that, which is what happens to people. They get tired out just pushing against the system that doesn't seem to respond. But also keep telling your stories and keep testing for weaknesses. Tell that story in a different way. Lots of tweets on social media, a scientific paper that you have a media release that comes around from a university that lets you push. You meet a ministerial advisor and say, gee whiz, this is a forgotten problem. There's some good news in this for you, Minister, if only we did the following. You know, it's all of those different testing it all the time. And the patience, I think, I'm not naturally a patient person, so it's actually really difficult to do, but it's something you learn if you want to be effective. If you step out of the system, as I've said, you can sometimes make things happen really fast, but you can also break your connections and mean you don't have any role in the future as well. So that's the trade-off and the challenge.
Right, well, we've hit 12:30, I'm afraid, so we might have to vacate the room.